Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky. So now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax.
What's happening to American budget carriers? Unless you closely watch airline business news, you probably missed a story announcing that Southwest Airlines was going to start allowing their flights to be posted on Expedia. And then we found out that Southwest's famous first come, first served seating policy is being replaced with a new guaranteed seat selection option. And even their famous free checked-in bags are being abandoned. So what's going on? The changes at Southwest and its competitors mark a significant departure from the classic business model for low-cost airlines that goes back decades and has always set these airlines apart from their full-fare competitors. But this raises the question, if US budget airlines like Southwest are changing what makes them famous, does that mean the segment is going away entirely? And what will the major carriers do to respond? What does it mean when American budget airlines are struggling while European ones excel? Let's find out. The low-cost model in the United States took off after the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act, which removed government control over fares, routes and market entry. This opened the door for new airlines to compete on price, efficiency and service innovation. Southwest Airlines became the poster child of this new era, proving that a no-frills, point-to-point model and low fares and high aircraft utilization could be profitable. Their relentless focus on streamlining and the use of a single aircraft type helped them ride this to huge success in the 80s and 90s. Having a single aircraft type provides huge operational benefits. It means that all the pilots are qualified to operate all of the aircraft. So if an aircraft gets stuck down route somewhere, any of the airline's pilots can be rostered to go and fly it back. And this also makes flight crew, cabin crew and engineering training so much simpler. And this can reduce delays and means that airlines can negotiate volume discounts on planes and spares, keeping costs down, not just when they buy the planes, but across their entire life. Now, of course, the key to this model is getting planes full and in the air as much as possible, as this is where they're making money. And is in fact the root of Southwest's unique first come, first served seating style, where passengers picked whichever seat they wanted, helping reduce turnaround times. These changes allowed these new airlines to become true giants. Southwest's fleet, for example, has 800 aircraft, and Ryanair's fleet of over 600 make them some of the largest airlines in the world. And in Frontier and Allegiant and Spirit all have more than 100 each. But before we get too deep into this, I want to talk about a few of the different types of budget airlines and how they all fit together in the market. Generally speaking, the pricier options tend to be the major airlines and flag carriers. These airlines focus on fancy reward programs, global reach and perks for their most valuable customers, business travellers. These airlines are usually based at hubs, with nearly all of their flights either starting at or finishing at a hub. At the other end of the spectrum, ultra low cost carriers like Ryanair, Spirit and Allegiant take a much different approach, making their base fares as low as possible whilst charging for everything else, including carry-on bags, refreshments and seat selection. This allowed these airlines to serve smaller markets, thriving on the lower costs of using smaller airports. They aggressively target underserved areas of the country and focused on the budget traveller. Vacationing families and students, for instance, make up a much larger portion of these airlines' customer bases than they would a major legacy carrier. So that's the two extremes. But in the middle then is a third, more nebulous category, the leisure airlines. These airlines follow some of the same strategies as the ultra low cost carriers, but with some key differences. Instead of obsessively focusing on a single aircraft type and engine choice, some have a mixed fleet of aircraft. JetBlue, for example, flies A220s, A320s, A321s, and even some smaller Embraer E190s. Some of them even embrace a more point-to-point model and generally focus on vacation and personal travellers while still offering some of the conveniences that the larger airlines offer, including some options to book continuing flights on a mainline carrier using the same reservation system. Alaska Airlines went even further in 2021 by becoming a full member of the One World Airline Alliance. These airlines sought to be cheaper than the mainline, but also set themselves apart with an approach that focused more on unique touches and exemplary customer service for their passengers. A key part of the strategy for Southwest was controlling how customers booked their flights. Southwest refused to list flights on third-party travel websites, forcing customers to book directly with its site. This helped the airline avoid paying commissions to online travel agencies while also maintaining control over pricing and branding. People flying on Southwest didn't just pick the lowest fare from a spreadsheet, they went out of their way to pick Southwest. Ryanair too has had its fair share of fighting with third-party sites, announcing in January of last year that they wouldn't allow these sites to list their flights because they believed these sites were adding markups and fees that they didn't like being passed on to the passengers. So for low-cost carriers, the strategy of offering only basic services and charging extra for everything else has worked well for them for years. It kept their fares dramatically lower than mainline competitors and allowed them to carve out a profitable niche in the industry, a really profitable niche. Southwest had an incredible streak of success, earning a profit every single year from 1973 to 2020. Remember that, as we'll come back to it. But business is a cat and mouse game of constant adaptation, and eventually the mainline carriers caught up. They realised that they could offer their own lower cost basic fares with nothing included. These basic economy fares were close to those of the low cost carriers, but included some of the perks of a global mileage program and the ability to continue on to international destinations in Europe, Africa or Asia if a passenger chose to do so. These mainline carriers could continue to place downward pressure on the budget airlines because they could subsidise the cost with premium and business travels, many of whom would book last-minute high-fare tickets, as well as expensive airport lounges and onward flights to their true cash cow, premium international travel. This financial cushion allows full-service airlines to compete aggressively on price with perks that low-cost carriers just simply cannot offer. Another advantage that low-cost carriers have historically relied on is higher aircraft utilisation rates compared to their legacy counterparts. By turning planes around quicker and flying more sectors per day, low-cost carriers could spread expensive fixed costs like aircraft leasing across more flights, making each flight cheaper to operate. And it was this operational efficiency that gave them a key competitive advantage, especially against full-service airlines with slower hub and spoke networks. But that reliance on utilisation becomes a major vulnerability when things go wrong. For Spirit, engine issues with the Pratt & Whitney GTFs have forced dozens of planes out of service, gutting their entire schedule and revenue. And similarly, Southwest has struggled with Boeing 737 MAX delivery delays, forcing them to keep older, less efficient planes in service longer than planned. And when utilisation drops, the maths that make low-cost models work starts to break down, exposing how fragile the system can be. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down global air travel, airlines had to park entire fleets for months and deal with reduced demand for years. Low-cost carriers like Allegiant, who actually owned more or less their entire fleet, were able to bring aircraft back online only as needed, staving off some of the worst of the damage, while Southwest, with their massive fleet of newer 737s, lost out. Now, of course, everybody posted losses in the pandemic, but for Southwest, 2020 was the first time they posted a full annual loss since 1973. And it's ironic that the same choices that these airlines made to save themselves money have also been the undoing for some of them. You see, having one type of plane and one type of engine is a bit like only growing one kind of produce. Sometimes you could have a bumper harvest with so many blueberries that you're turning purple, but other times you get a drought and lose the entire crop. And that is what more or less happened to Southwest with their entire airline built around the 737. For decades, they had aggressively sought volume discounts with Boeing by making huge orders for the newest planes. banking on their superior efficiency and reliability to make up for the expensive payment to lessors and finance companies. But the groundings and delays of the 737, specifically the 737 MAX 7, have cost Southwest dearly, with their stock badly underperforming compared to their mainline competitors, something Southwest directly attributes to the delays in the 737 MAX deliveries. Now, we have talked before about the changes that are being brought to Southwest by active investors, and these are ongoing. But Southwest aren't alone in this. Similarly, these same types of problems have affected Spirit Airlines, as the A320neo engines from Pratt & Whitney have caused no end of headache, as we've also discussed before. And in India, Go First declared insolvency in 2023 over issues it was having with those very same Pratt & Whitney engines. Now, separately, while the major airlines were squeezing these carriers on margin, passengers have grown weary of these same low-cost carriers squeezing them, literally into seats with less legroom and complicated pricing and boarding systems. And many passengers demand more nowadays, and lower low-cost carrier revenues, in the United States at least, seem to support that. However, it looks like low-cost carriers are trying to adapt. But how? Well, Spirit, for example, once the poster child for charging for every conceivable add-on and the smallest seats, has introduced larger, more comfortable seats in the front of its cabins. This move signals a willingness to cater for travellers willing to pay a little bit more for comfort. And Spirit has also tested bundling prices for customers who prefer a simple fare over the a la carte experience that made them and the ultra low cost carrier model famous. And these experiments mark a significant shift in strategy, aiming to appeal to a broader range of travellers. In another shift, JetBlue, though not a traditional low-cost carrier, has also moved into premium territory with its Mint service. On long transcontinental US routes, JetBlue now offers lie-flat business class seats, which they call Mint suites, and while these are smaller than the ones offered by the major legacy carriers on their wide-body aircraft, they are nonetheless an impressive feature on a single-aisle Airbus A321LR, and provide an experience that competes directly with legacy carriers. And in 2021, JetBlue specifically announced that they would use these suites to try to compete directly with the legacy carriers on the New York to London route, which is one of the most profitable routes in the world. And this puts it a far cry from the budget airline model it was founded on. And even Southwest is rethinking some of its core aspects of the business model. The airline is experimenting with assigned seating, which could impact one of its greatest operational strengths, lightning fast boarding. Historically, open seating has allowed Southwest to achieve quick turnarounds, enabling higher aircraft utilization. But if assigned seating adds time on the ground, it could result in the number of flights each aircraft completes daily being reduced. And of course, Southwest made massive headlines when they announced that they will, for the first time ever, charge for bags and reservation changes. This is a move that not only raises short-term revenue for bag fees, it also encourages passengers to check fewer bags, creating more space in the hold for highly profitable freight. And all of these fees are now on Southwest tickets, unless of course you hold a Southwest airline credit card. Most likely because Southwest would almost certainly like to be able to earn as much from credit cards as the legacy airlines in the US do. Credit card partnerships have become a huge cash cow for legacy carriers, with Delta earning nearly $7.4 billion from its partnership with American Express, a number that represents nearly 12% of their entire revenue for the year. Now, another noteworthy trend here is the shift away from small secondary airports. Low-cost carriers, which initially thrive by operating out of cheaper, less congested airports, are increasingly battling for gate space at the major hubs. Now, this shift raises operational costs and increases competition with the mainline carriers, but is often a desirable factor for customers, especially if they have connections to other flights. But on the other hand, in Europe, the low-cost model remains alive and well, with Ryanair definitely leading the pack. The more point-to-point nature of European travel lends itself to a low-cost airline model, and companies like Ryanair have stuck to its low-cost model, and its strategy has paid off. Ryanair is now a bigger airline than many of the mainline carriers in the continent, and despite economic downturns, fluctuating fuel prices and the COVID-19 pandemic, it has consistently reported strong financial performance. And like Southwest, Ryanair has frequently used economic slowdowns as an opportunity to expand aggressively, ordering new aircraft at discounted rates and capturing market share while competitors pulled back. Their record-breaking order for Boeing 737 MAX aircraft in 2023 underlines their long-term confidence in the model in spite of its delays. Meanwhile, EasyJet occupies more of a hybrid leisure position in Europe. While still fundamentally a low-cost carrier, EasyJet offers a more leisure-style experience than Ryanair, and this approach allows EasyJet to capture a slightly more premium segment of the market while still keeping fares competitive. Both Ryanair and EasyJet showcase that low-cost model remains viable when executed with discipline and clarity. Globally, their success stands in contrast to the challenges faced by US low-cost carriers, underscoring that market dynamics, regulatory environments, and strategic execution all play critical roles. And where American low-cost carriers have struggled with rising costs and competitive pressures, Europe's low-cost giants have stayed laser-focused on their core strengths, proving that the model can work in the right market conditions. Looking forward, American low-cost carriers appear to be moving towards a hybrid model, mixing low-cost basics with premium features. The question here though is whether this evolution is sustainable or if it marks the beginning of the end for traditional budget airline strategies. Could a new ultra low-cost carrier emerge to fill the gap if these airlines shift too far upscale? Or will rising costs and passenger expectations prevent new entrants from replicating the bare bones success of earlier low-cost carriers? Well, yes and no. The industry has been trending towards more consolidation in recent years, not less, and the market conditions for starting a new airline right now are tenuous as the industry is still not fully recovered from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that said, some new entrants with some familiar faces are trying some new and innovative approaches as low-cost airlines, particularly in the United States. Avalo is trying to beat Allegiant at their own game by offering point-to-point flights in underserved American markets with older 737-7 and 800s. And Breeze Airlines, which was founded by David Neilman, a serial airline entrepreneur and founder of JetBlue, among others. Breeze flies A220s and Embraer E195s point to point between smaller regional airports in what they see as underserved markets. Perhaps most interesting in this market is JSX, which is theoretically a charter airline who recently started operating some point-to-point regional routes. JSX flies Embraer E145s in an all-premium configuration, and its charter status means that passengers can clear customs and board the plane much faster. And on top of all of these, of course, there are numerous smaller boutique low-cost airlines like France's La Compagnie, which runs a tiny fleet of Airbus A321neos in an all-lie-flat business class configuration, and French Bee, which is operating a fleet of Airbus A350s. But the market for low-cost long-haul is too complex for us to get into in this video. You can see this video on the collapse of Norwegian Air Shuttle for a little more information on why these operations face more challenges than the typical low-cost airlines. Now, finally, there is the risk of brand dilution. With mainline carriers in the US, Europe and elsewhere offering low-cost options and some low-cost carriers offering more premium options, it's getting harder, from the passenger's perspective at least, to tell them apart. So maintaining a clear identity in both cases is becoming harder. If Spirit, Southwest and others continue down this path, they might find themselves competing more directly with the semi-low-cost or leisure carriers like JetBlue and Alaska Airlines, rather than sticking to the traditional low-cost space. And at the same time, legacy carriers like Delta and American may continue to refine their basic economy offerings, further blurring the lines between low-cost and mainline services. All of these changes together point towards an industry that is going to have to compete on price alone, relying on their operational efficiency and the advantages over major airlines. But there is the possibility that these changes can backfire. If low-cost airlines raise prices too much or complicate their business models, they could alienate their core customers, the travellers who expect a no-frills, budget-friendly experience. And the next few years will really reveal whether these moves are just temporary adjustments or the start of a broader transformation in the airline industry. Now, of course, this is still a bit of an oversimplification of the subject because, again, there's just too many differentiators between the carriers, even within the mainline or low-cost or leisure groups, to assign them into neat little boxes. The airlines sort of shifting and moving where they fit in the market It's kind of just how the airline market works, so perhaps a shift like this was inevitable. But what do you think? Are these changes good for us travellers? What happens next for the major leisure and low-cost airlines? Let us know in the comments below.
It is the 7th largest airline in the United States and the country's first airline to go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in over a decade. But why? Well, as it turns out, it involved some bad timing, a lot of bad luck and maybe a little bit of politics too. And while the Chapter 11 bankruptcy could be the airline's way out, it could also bring a new twist to the story. Stay tuned. This actually isn't a news story. I first made a video about Spirit's headaches over 2 years ago in the summer of 2022, after which JetBlue had emerged as the winner in a long battle over who was going to buy Spirit. Yes, you wouldn't know it by looking at the state of the airline today, but early in 2022, Spirit was actually a really hot ticket. Back then, the two airlines fighting over it was JetBlue and Frontier, and while Frontier was the first to start talks with Spirit, JetBlue soon became the much more aggressive suitor. But a lot has changed since then. Late in October this year, Spirit announced plans to furlough around 330 pilots and to also downgrade 120 captains to first officers, which is something that airlines just almost never do. And all of this came after they had already furloughed 186 pilots in last September. Then, on the 18th of November, Spirit Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. And when its shares stopped trading on that day, they had lost 90% of their value compared to the start of 2024. So what's going on here? Well, to understand this, we need to go back to 2022 and look at the reason why Spirit and Frontier had wanted to join forces in the first place. Basically, after 9/11, several big mergers and acquisitions had taken place who had eventually led to what we today refer to as the Big Four: American Airlines, Delta, Southwest and United. Now, that's in alphabetical order, but as it happens, it's also the order they come in terms of passenger numbers. Between them, these companies control around 80% of the US domestic market, with Alaska Airlines in 5th place behind them. And Alaska was actually the last airline in the country to acquire another airline, Virgin America, back in 2016, which I'll come back to later. Now, that whole airline consolidation was deemed necessary after 9/11 for several different reasons, but this wasn't going to be everyone's view forever. The industry has become much more robust over time, which is a good thing, but that also means that regulators have gradually become more wary about how the market is becoming maybe a little bit too consolidated. Obviously, the more airlines there are fighting over passengers on a given route, the more choice for the traveling public, and that competition drives prices down. But if airlines merge or strike up deals to share traffic, well, then there's no need for competition and the prices can start to go up, at least in theory. That is why in recent years we have seen several government moves to stop airlines consolidating. For example, back in 2020, JetBlue and American Airlines started what they called the Northeast Alliance, a joint venture that would see them combine routes out of JFK and Boston airports. The airlines claimed that the move would benefit customers by allowing them to connect flights between the two airlines thanks to coordinated schedules and booking systems. And on top of that, they even combined some benefits in their loyalty programs. But in September of 2021, the Justice Department and 6 US states sued to block this joint venture based on those competitive grounds that I just mentioned. And in May of 2023, a federal judge also sided with the Justice Department and ordered the two airlines to stop their alliance within 30 days from his ruling. Now, JetBlue and American later appealed that decision unsuccessfully, but we might not have heard the end of that story yet. Anyway, whilst all of that was going on, first Frontier, then JetBlue tried to acquire Spirit. Now, a tie-up between Frontier and Spirit would have been relatively simple to explain. Both airlines are ultra low-cost carriers with very similar operating models, and their networks were also quite similar, particularly around Florida. On top of that, both of them also had an all Airbus A320 family fleet, would therefore be quite easy to combine. And by the way, these similarities weren't entirely coincidental. Frontier Airlines is a subsidiary of Indigo Partners, and that same company was a major investor in Spirit back in the mid-2000s when it transitioned into becoming a low-cost carrier. Frontier then followed a very similar evolution, so the shared DNA between those two companies actually isn't very surprising. Anyway, a merger between Spirit and Frontier would have beaten Alaska Airlines as the 5th largest airline in the country. But then JetBlue suddenly entered into the picture from basically nowhere with its own bid for Spirit, which would have also created the 5th biggest airline in the US. Now, Frontier and Spirit wanted to join forces because this would have made them into a powerful ultra low-cost carrier entity, something that would really have been able to compete with the likes of Southwest Airlines, for example. But the purpose of JetBlue's bid for Spirit was, well, let's say a little bit different. Because JetBlue was mostly interested in Spirit's route network and its airport slots at key airports around the country. And crucially, JetBlue is a leisure carrier, not a low-cost or ultra-low-cost carrier. So in that case, JetBlue would have not operated Spirit as a separate entity. Instead, Spirit's fleet would have just been reconfigured into JetBlue's specifications with fewer seats and in a less dense cabin. And that was something that the US Justice Department really didn't like. The DOJ again argued that the JetBlue-Spirit merger would hurt competition because some shared routes between the two carriers would be merged, ULCC ticket prices would turn into leisure prices, and the overall number of available seats would definitely go down. And that argument made quite a lot of sense, right? Well, the DOJ thought so. So a federal judge in January of 2024 blocked JetBlue's $3.8 billion deal to buy Spirit. Both airlines obviously initially protested, but they then gave up their efforts to appeal only a few months later. Now, to be clear, the objection of the Department of Justice over JetBlue's acquisition of Spirit didn't come as a surprise to basically anyone. In fact, Spirit's agreement to the JetBlue acquisition actually even included a compensation if the acquisition was blocked because of regulatory pressure. And when JetBlue and Frontier were fighting over Spirit back in 2022, Spirit's own management stated that JetBlue's acquisition was indeed more likely to hit regulatory hurdles. But the problem was that blocking the JetBlue-Spirit tie-up on competition grounds made sense only if we assume that Spirit could continue to operate just fine without it. And as it turns out, some other developments who were happening in parallel with all of this were making that assumption impossible. When the JetBlue-Spirit merger was blocked in January of 2024, the judge actually wrote in his closing, "Spirit is a small airline, but there are those who love it. To those dedicated customers of Spirit, this one's for you." Why? Because the Clayton Act, a 109-year-old statute, requires this result. A statute that continues to deliver for the American people. So the judge referred to the Clayton Act because this was an antitrust law designed to stop things like monopolies, cartels, and other such entities that could hurt competition. But it would soon turn out that this closing statement didn't age very well. Because just hours after the ruling, analysts were already raising the alarm about Spirit's future, and the investors seemed to agree because the airline's stock price immediately plummeted. And that was despite the fact that Spirit's shares had already lost a lot of their value after JetBlue had agreed to buy it. Actually, behind closed doors, JetBlue's management was relieved that the deal had fallen through. So, why did this happen, and why couldn't Spirit just continue operating as an ultra low-cost carrier like it had done for nearly 2 decades at this point? Well, it turns out that there are about 2 main reasons for this. First came the problems that the company was having with their Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engines, who required lengthy, unscheduled inspections. It had been found that impurities in powdered metal alloys used to manufacture some of the engine's high-pressure compressor discs could cause these engines to suffer early fatigue issues if they weren't dealt with properly. This was, and still is, a huge problem that could affect as many as 1,200 Airbus A320neo engines worldwide. And the big problem here is that each engine will need between 60 and 300 days to fix it, which is of course an insane amount of time. A disruption like that will keep a lot of engine maintenance and repair shops very busy and loads of jets grounded for months. And this actually has a knock-on effect on overall aircraft maintenance capacity worldwide, something that I will cover in a later video. But as it turns out, Spirit were particularly exposed to this engine problem, with dozens of their aircraft having to be grounded. And at the same time, they also had a second issue, which is overcapacity. The problem here is that as Spirit grew during the previous years, they added loads of flights to their existing network, particularly around their base in Florida. But they were doing that while other airlines were also doing the exact same thing on the same routes. And as I said before, Spirit is an ultra low-cost carrier, and while that has been a profitable working model for a very long time, it can also be a little bit inflexible. The keys to making low-cost carrier models work is to keep the planes in the air for as long as possible, as full of passengers as possible, and ideally with a fleet of jets that are as efficient as possible. So Spirit now found themselves with a fleet of brand new but grounded jets without engines and functional but older and less efficient jets flying with too few passengers on board in a very competitive market. And even when they managed to fill those aircraft up, the price of each seat was sold for something that wasn't that high as the airline actually needed it to be, since their price was one of their only competitive advantages. And by the way, if this sounds a little bit familiar to you, then you might just be remembering a recent video that I made about Southwest Airlines. So thank you for being a regular viewer. You see, Southwest has a similar problem, not because of faulty engines, but because of each of its new 737 MAXs are a little bit bigger than they actually want them to be. For many years, Southwest network has been built around a large fleet of 737-700s, which have fewer seats than its newer 737 MAX 8s have. And the smaller MAX 7s that Southwest actually wanted isn't yet certified. So Southwest is having to figure out how to keep being profitable while flying around with a lot of empty seats. Another problem that both Spirit and Southwest are sharing is that after the pandemic, demand for bare fare flights in the United States seems to be dropping rapidly. Travel habits do change over time, and some analysts are now quickly coming to the conclusion that the days of the low-cost carriers are coming to an end. But personally, I am a little bit skeptical of that. I think that the problems with the MAX for Southwest and the Airbus A320neo engines for Spirit are really skewing the picture that we're seeing right now, but I guess we'll find that out. It is true though that other airlines with both short, medium and long-haul operations are less financially exposed to the kind of overcapacity problems that particularly affect airlines like Spirit, Southwest and Frontier. That's why all three of these airlines have recently announced changes to their operations, like the introduction of premium fares, who basically moved them away from the traditional low-cost carrier or ultra-low-cost carrier model. So, where does Spirit go from here then? What does Chapter 11 bankruptcy actually mean for them and their future? Well, here is where I need to talk a little bit about what a Chapter 11 bankruptcy really is and what it isn't. When I made a video about Norwegian Airlines and their bankruptcy recently, some people in the comments got a little bit upset with my use of the term bankruptcy. So, just to be clear, in English at least, bankruptcy is not the same as liquidation. Liquidation is what will be described in the US as a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and as its name suggests, it's such a bankruptcy the company stops conducting all business and its assets are sold off to pay its debts. If anything is left after those debts are paid in full, well then the company's owners can keep that money. But Chapter 11 is not like that. Chapter 7 and 11 are specific terms to the United States, but other countries have very similar laws and conditions for bankruptcy. For example, Norwegian was primarily based in Ireland, so it restructured under the examinership process, which is very similar to Chapter 11 bankruptcy protections in the US. In the United States, the first form of what we today call Chapter 11 appeared in the 1800s, and in the second half of the 19th century, it was a vital part in keeping US railroad infrastructure going. You see, vital infrastructure companies like railroads or much later airlines are perfect examples of companies where these type of laws makes perfect sense. I'm not going to analyze it here because I'm not a lawyer. Maybe this is something for Legal Eagle, which is a great channel by the way. But basically the idea behind Chapter 11 is to hold back a company's creditors to keep them from interfering, or at least from interfering too much, while the organization is trying to get back on its feet. Even though this process is supposed to keep creditors at bay, in practice, creditors often want Chapter 11 to happen because the process tends to remove existing uncertainties about the viability of the company. Obviously, this all depends on the circumstances, and those can vary a lot between different companies, but there are often discussions and agreements in place before a Chapter 11 process is officially in place, which is worth remembering. Anyway, during this process, the recovery of the business is overseen by a court which will examine it and hopefully approve a viable recovery plan, which the company and its creditors all agree on, or even have agreed on before. In other words, Chapter 11 is a nice bit of state intervention through the court system without any real use of state funds, designed to help avoid the complete collapse of vitally important companies, among other things. And that explains why Chapter 11 is actually very familiar to airlines in the US. Since the days of deregulation in the late 1970s, pretty much all airlines in the United States have gone through Chapter 11 at least once, and having gone through it twice isn't particularly rare either. Aside from some airlines that emerged recently, there's only one US airline that have never gone through Chapter 11, and that's Southwest Airlines. Southwest was actually profitable from its launch in the early 1970s all the way up until 2019, a 47-year streak that was only broken by the pandemic. But the point that I want to make here is that in the airline world at least, Chapter 11 bankruptcy actually often leads to recovery. While the airline goes through the process, they normally continue to operate normally, although understandably some passengers, especially those booking months ahead of traveling, might prefer booking with someone else, and that's why airlines prefer to get through this process as fast as possible. Now sometimes the company doesn't survive in its original form and ends up getting bought, rebranded or absorbed into another airline. That's, for example, what happened with TWA when it became part of American Airlines. And sometimes these discussions and agreements before Chapter 11 can be really formal. So much so that the process is done almost preemptively, meaning before any real financial trouble properly hits the airline. An example of that was when American Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection back in November of 2011. What made that notable and a little bit weird was that less than 3 months earlier, American had placed what was at the time the world's single largest aircraft order of 460 single-aisle jets split between Airbus and Boeing. An order that actually launched the 737 MAX, by the way. Now that procedure was mainly aimed at dealing with labor costs and rising fuel prices, and there is quite a bit more background to it, but the point is that American had enough cash to keep operating even without Chapter 11 in place. So what about Spirit then? Are they in genuine trouble, or is this a preemptive Chapter 11 filing? Well, Spirit does seem to have key debts that it needs to pay in the coming months, but the good news is that its Chapter 11 filing came after a long and constructive set of talks with many of their key creditors. And that suggests that the airline has a plan in place, which I think a judge will probably approve to see it survive. But remember that I promised a twist at the start of the video? Well, in my first video on Spirit over 2 years ago, I said that the most likely winner of the JetBlue Spirit merger was Frontier. Because with Spirit gone as an ultra low-cost carrier, Frontier would basically have that market cornered. Now, Frontier has had to adjust to the same challenges as Spirit, but its shares have done much better than Spirit's, and they decided to shift over to a more premium passenger market much earlier than both Spirit and Southwest did. But the thing is, at one point during the recent weeks, Spirit actually restarted merger talks with Frontier, presumably at much lower prices than those discussed back in 2022. Now, officially, those talks then ended without leading to anything definitive, but is that really the end, you think? You see, when those merger talks were revived in October, the story was that a deal between the two companies would likely happen as part of Spirit's restructuring of its debts and some other liabilities in bankruptcy. And that is exactly what Chapter 11 bankruptcy is for. So maybe this is just a planned strategy designed to clear the way for a final Frontier takeover. But even if such a deal is still on the cards, do you think it would pass government regulators? Well, as it turns out, Biden's outgoing government is re-examining the competitive nature of the country's airline market, given the rapid changes in the industry over the last couple of years. And of course, the country's new administration is very likely to change its general attitude towards all type of mergers. So a Frontier Spirit get-together and even that JetBlue American Northeast Alliance might still have some life in them. I think so. Some airlines seem to be in an almost perpetual crisis, and yet they are refusing to die. How are they still around, and how did these zombie airlines survive the pandemic, a time when even some really healthy and profitable airlines almost went under? Stay tuned. Commercial aviation is a very cyclic industry. There are times when demand for travel is booming, before a slump in the economy almost brings everything to a halt, and then everything tends to pick back up again. In fact, commercial aviation sometimes acts a bit like a canary in the coal mine for the whole of the business world. You see, a lot of airline revenue depends on holiday and leisure travel, and obviously when there is a general financial slump, cutting down on travel is one of the first things that people do, which means that the airlines are among the first to suffer from a downturn. Businesses also cut down on non-essential travel when hard times hit, but the point is that all of this doesn't seem to be happening consistently across all airlines. Instead, some airlines seem to always follow a different pattern. From time to time, you might hear of an airline's name in the news that is just always seeming to be in financial trouble, and a few weeks later, or maybe months later, you'll hear the same airline's name again in the exact same context. Even when the industry is on an upward trajectory, these airlines still don't seem to be doing particularly well. So no matter what happens, these companies seem to almost sleepwalk through a kind of parallel universe. So what is it that keeps them from going bankrupt or just disappearing? Now, it's not hard to figure out that something like state support probably has a lot to do with this, but it turns out that there is way more to this story than that. I have to make that clear, because if it isn't obvious already, this is a topic that can cause some quite strong reactions, and that's because to some extent, sentiment and national pride are important factors here. So let's look at some of these airlines, and before some of you get mad at me, I want to make it absolutely clear here that in previous videos where I've looked at airlines and their troubles, many of you guys asked me to look at some or even all of the companies that I'm now about to mention. Let's start with Alitalia. This is one of Europe's most historic airlines, which came into being just after World War II. Back then it was called Aerolini Italiane Internazionali and was operating aircraft like the Fiat G12 and the Savoia Marchetti SM95, which had both been built during the war. Over the years, the company's ownership has included various private investors and even its own employees, but one way or another, Alitalia remained a majority state-owned airline until 2009. But its financial problems began well before that. Already back in the 1990s, the Italian government had sought to find a private buyer for the airline, and as part of that, Alitalia signed partnerships with KLM and other companies, and they also joined the Alliance Sky team in 2001. When KLM and Air France formed a joint group back in 2004, there was a hope at Alitalia that they would also join them, but that never happened. Meanwhile, all the way from Alitalia's founding until the early 2000s, the Italian government continued to inject mountains of money into the airline. That was completely necessary, because the company just wasn't profitable. Throughout its existence as a state-owned airline, Alitalia only ever recorded profit in 1 year, and that was back in 1998. Now that obviously couldn't continue. European and international competition laws made cash injections and other types of state support harder and harder to justify, which is why the airline had to eventually be privatized. In the end, this was done by splitting the company into a healthy part that would get privatized and a bad part, which would assume all of the debts of the old state-owned company. Obviously, that also meant that all of those debts would then become the burden of the Italian taxpayers, but that seemed acceptable to everyone since the Italian taxpayers had already been paying for the original Alitalia anyway. But this wasn't the end of the story. The new private Alitalia group tried to reorganize itself into a different type of entity than its old troubled parent company, but they just continued to post losses. So in 2015, just 6 years after them going private, Alitalia had to be reorganized again. Now that was pretty quick, but the next reorganization would come even sooner. Because already in 2017, the airline was put under a bankruptcy process, which allowed it to continue to operate similar to how a Chapter 11 process would be done in the United States. The following negotiations for Alitalia's future involved potential investors and also its employees, but things were moving way too slow. A lot of companies offered to buy a stake in Alitalia, but finding and approving a sale of a majority stake was proving impossible. There were even forces in Italy who actually wanted Alitalia to be renationalized again, which of course should have been impossible. Now, I am leaving out a lot of details here, but the point is that the airline basically remained in limbo until the year 2020. And when the pandemic hit, it became absolutely clear to everyone that Alitalia wouldn't stand a chance without state support. So they got it. The airline was effectively nationalized again in May of that same year. Now, a lot of people expected Alitalia to just be reorganized and reprivatized again, but instead a new group emerged with a different brand name called Italia Trasporto Aereo, or ITA. So why did that happen? Why did they suddenly change name? I mean, Alitalia had by that point been reorganized so many times, and each time before they had been able to just continue with the same name. Well, as it turns out, that was actually the problem. Allowing the company to continue under the same name seemed a bit unfair to the European Commission on competitive grounds. You see, an airline's brand has a lot of value on its own, and allowing it to go on with the same identity just seemed unacceptable. Also, things like airport slots that Alitalia owned in various big airport hubs around the world had a lot of value, and the same went for things like its customer loyalty program. Now, ITA eventually ended up acquiring many of Alitalia's old slots, but the European Commission didn't allow it to get Alitalia's original Mille Miglia customer loyalty program. At its inception, ITA was also state-owned, while the search for a buyer continued. And eventually the Italian government reached a deal with the Lufthansa group, initially for a minority stake of just 41% of the airline, but ultimately Lufthansa actually wants a controlling stake. Now, to be clear here, Alitalia isn't the only airline to follow this loss-making path. Other carriers, like the old Olympic Airways in Greece, followed a very similar fate for the most part, and we're going to soon mention some others too. But why do airlines like Alitalia become zombies? Why did the airline continue making losses throughout its existence, and how could something like this be allowed to continue for this long? Well, to a certain extent, it's a story of persistence and proof that surviving isn't always about thriving. So to understand how an airline can reach the position Alitalia found itself in before 2020, we need to talk a little bit about flag carriers and how their role have evolved over the years. The term flag carrier is actually older than aviation itself. Like a lot of other things in our industry, it's a seafaring term, but its meaning has remained more or less the same in our industry. A flag carrier is a company which may or may not be state-owned, but whose role has a national significance for its home country. Even if it doesn't represent its country officially, a flag carrier is recognizable as a company from that country, and as such, it may have a special status, enjoy special privileges, or often both. So what does that mean then? Well, traditionally a flag carrier may have, for example, had the first pick for slots at major airports, get the nicest gates, lounges and other amenities in big terminals, along with many other perks. The features and roles of flag carriers have evolved over time, and they're definitely not the same around the world today. Most countries generally just have one flag carrier, but for example in the United States today, it's not just American, Delta and United that holds this status. Technically, any US airline that flies internationally is a US flag carrier, which means that they all have an American flag displayed somewhere. And that painted flag is another piece of seafaring customs, by the way. But the point here is that flag carrier airlines don't just get perks in their home countries. Many of them also have some important responsibilities. For some countries, a national airline is a key way of keeping in touch with the national diaspora of its people around the globe. So even relatively small countries like Ireland or Israel have maintained airlines with a route network that caters to the transportation needs of that part of the population. So the point is that for a national carrier like these and for many others, maintaining nationally important routes could take priority over things that would be deal breakers for any other airline, like profitability, for example. Having said that though, there are still quite a lot of national or flag carriers that are profitable and subject to the usual ups and downs of the industry. But for many years, especially back in the 1950s, 60s and through much of the 70s, these flag carriers didn't have to worry too much about being profitable. In a previous video, I looked at how nice air travel used to be in the good old days compared to what it's like today. A lot of people today see pictures of what looked like roomy cabins, passengers using normal cutlery and eating from plates on tablecloths, and we rue the days when air travel was, well, civilized. But as I explained, that image is more than a little bit misleading. For one thing, the cabin of an old 707 is just as wide as that of a 737 today, and both jets have 3 seats on each side of the aisle in economy, although legroom, I guess, might be another story. But more importantly for this story, from the point of view of an airline, the typical air passenger back in the 1960s is not the typical passenger flying today. Basically, in terms of fare prices, what passengers were paying in the 1960s would be equivalent to a business class ticket today, and maybe even more than that. And the reason for this was that the airline industry back then was tightly regulated. Ticket prices for specific routes were fixed. Airlines had to get permission to fly the routes that they wanted, and for international flights, prices were subject to bilateral agreements between the countries. So for example, a flight from JFK in New York to London Heathrow in the UK back then would cost as much as $550, which is closer to $4,000 in today's money. And the same tight restrictions were also in place for domestic flights in most countries. The reason for these very anti-competitive rules were simply because in many places the aviation industry was seen as a strategically important national asset. This was partly because of what we've already covered. Countries wanted their people, including their diplomats and politicians, to be able to travel where they needed to go. But remember, this was also during the Cold War era, so big and small countries also had a strategic interest in maintaining their aviation industries. This included their aircraft manufacturers and suppliers, but also their pool of pilots, mechanics and engineers, all of whom could have reserved roles in the military if it would come to that. So the tightly regulated airline industry back then ensured that the airlines would always make money, even if individual routes weren't selling particularly well. But even though that was the case, not all airlines managed to make money. Alitalia, for example, actually wasn't profitable even during that era. Now, it is a little bit difficult to have a full explanation for why that was going back that far, but it is fair to say that some countries also saw their airline industry as a way to create a few more well-paying jobs and project a picture of glamour around its image. And again, back then, this might have seemed like a perfectly justifiable taxpayer expense. But that actually brings up a question. Didn't Alitalia's competition have something to say about this, about them constantly running on a deficit? Well, actually no, they didn't. Remember, prices were fixed and would be the same, for example, for Alitalia and Pan Am for a flight between Rome and JFK, and even the number of available seats was tightly regulated. So someone like Pan Am wouldn't really have any reason to care at all if Alitalia kept operating at a loss or if they were profitable. Because either way, Pan Am themselves would have to offer the same service at the same price. In general, since prices were fixed, airlines prefer to compete on things like amenities, airport lounges and other signature offerings. And if a country felt that it was worth to keep operating its flag carrier at a loss, well, then that was their taxpayers' decision. But all of this came to an end when the industry was deregulated. In the United States, the rules on domestic flight changed completely with the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. And for international flights, the first Open Skies agreements came into being in 1979, and their purpose was basically to remove most of the barriers that individual countries placed on foreign airlines. After these changes, airlines still needed to secure slots at busy airports, and they obviously must abide by the safety and other regulations, but otherwise they could set their own prices to compete with whatever they liked and whoever they liked and do basically whatever they wanted. Well, sort of. There are still negotiations in place for rights to fly to and from or to overfly specific countries or to make stops under certain conditions along the way. Now, if you're interested in learning more, you can look up Freedoms of the Air. It's quite fascinating. But the point is that Open Skies and other initiatives, including broader international competition laws, meant that it is no longer practical for an airline to operate continuously at a loss. And for a lot of flag carriers who had built up bloated organizations with glitzy headquarters, loads of different aircraft types and a very relaxed control of their expenses, based on the guaranteed incomes from a regulated market and from taxpayer handouts, this became a very harsh reality to wake up to. Now, I really don't want to single out Alitalia or ITA here because there are many other similar airline stories out there. In the United States, true aviation giants like Pan Am and TWA, who thrived before deregulation and open skies, couldn't adjust to these new conditions and still remain competitive back in the 1980s and 1990s.
End of the runway for Pan American.
Pan Am ceased to exist in 1991 and TWA held on for another decade, trying its own rounds of restructurings and changes in ownership, but ultimately what was left of it in 2001 then became part of American Airlines. Many other airlines still operate today but have chronic inefficiencies that routinely get them into the news cycle. SAS, or Scandinavian Airlines for example, have made several reorganizations and restructurings throughout the last few decades, interspersed with the odd cash injection by Sweden and Denmark every once in a while. But I actually think that might have stopped now, and the latest kind of updates from them look very encouraging. TAP Air Portugal is another flag carrier with a long and troubled history, which saw it getting privatized, nationalized, privatized, nationalized, and they are now due for a privatization again, if a buyer can be found. Apparently Lufthansa, AIG and the Air France KLM group are interested. And that actually brings me to another trend that we can clearly see today. You see, unlike the airline industry in the United States, which experienced substantial consolidation through mergers and acquisitions after 9/11, Europe's aviation industry still remains quite fragmented, but that might be about to change. Of course, the problem is that, unlike the United States, Europe isn't one country. And while the European Union has homogenized a lot of the ways that its countries work with each other, individual countries still make their own decisions on many national affairs, including their flag carriers. This makes it much harder for airline mergers to go ahead in Europe than in the US. They still do go ahead, but typically the old airline names are then maintained, at least in some form. So how does it actually look in Europe right now then? Well, a small number of big airline groups currently are competing to absorb basically all of the smaller players. One of them is the Lufthansa Group, who also owns Aerologic, Air Dolomiti, Austrian Airlines, Brussels Airlines, Discover Airlines, Edelweiss Air, Eurowings, Sun Express and Swiss. Then there is the Air France-KLM Group, which besides the airlines in its name also includes Martinair, Transavia, Transavia France, plus regionals Air France HOP and KLM Cityhopper. The third big player is International Airlines Group, or AIG, who owns Aer Lingus, British Airways, Iberia, Level, Vueling and a number of related regionals. And then we also have the low-cost carriers, or LCCs. The biggest of which is Ryanair, which also includes Buzz, Lauda Europe and Malta Air. And as it stands right now, Ryanair is actually bigger than the Air France-KLM Group, at least in the number of aircraft. Other European LCCs include Wizz Air, EasyJet and Norwegian, and it's quite possible that the LCC market could experience its own consolidation in the future. Although the other groups include airlines that operate as LCCs too. Now I mentioned fleet numbers because the size of each airline and the network it can support are key to its competitiveness and ultimately its survival. And for an extreme example of this, we can look at Air Malta. This company closed its doors early this year in 2024, although it was immediately then replaced by a new company called KM Malta. Before this, the airline had 1,400 people employed to operate just 9 aircraft. Now, that's a lot of people, and with a country of this size and a fleet that small, its operation would struggle to be efficient no matter what. But for reference, the new company will aim to do the same job with just 400 people. So different priorities and realities in staffing or in their fleet network will have a big role in whether old flag carriers will be able to be profitable in this new and modern world. Like I mentioned earlier, for many years there was a tendency among the old flag carriers to keep multiple different aircraft types in their fleets, and that obviously came with extreme costs in terms of maintenance, crew training and standardization. With the deregulation and the fierce competition that this brought, especially from the streamlined low-cost carriers who often only operated one single type, this became a burden that was slow and painful to get rid of. Ironically though, surviving the pandemic turned out to be relatively easy for these airlines. You see, if their state supporters had found ways to prop them up before, the pandemic was the perfect excuse to keep pushing more money into them, which kept them around for a little bit longer. But those days should be over now. The likelihood is that any airline which can't make money from now on will either be absorbed into a larger group or completely disappear. And in my view, that's kind of the way that it should be.
It calls itself Australia's favourite airline, but try telling that to the thousands of customers who've had flights cancelled and no refunds.
Embattled airline Qantas is again in chaos today without going...
Oh, how quickly an airline can fall from grace. Qantas has almost overnight gone from an internationally recognized and respected brand to one of a greedy corporation that has angered tens of thousands of its own customers, as well as millions more in its home country and beyond. And why was that? Stay tuned. In many of these videos, I'd like to give you a bit of history and context before I dive into the main topic. And in this case, that context is especially important. You see, this isn't a story of just another random corporation who did something questionable, annoying a big bunch of its customers. Now, to appreciate why the Qantas scandal enraged so many people in Australia, you really need to understand what this company means to the lovely people who live there. First of all, Qantas is actually an acronym. It stands for Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Services, which was the name that the airline used when it started its operation in November of 1922. Yeah, you heard that right. Qantas has already celebrated its 100th birthday. Now, the airline was actually founded a couple of years before that, in 1920, initially performing demonstration flights and some ad hoc charters with a two-seat Avro 504K biplane. But it was in 1922 that their regular mail and passenger services started, initially with just 2 aircraft. Qantas pride themselves on being the oldest continuously operating airline in the world, but if that's accurate depends on who you ask, and I'll get back to that shortly. The airline's 1920 start came just after the end of the First World War, which wasn't a coincidence. It was actually started by 2 former World War I veterans called Paul McGuinness and Hudson Fish, together with the company's first chairman, Fergus McMaster. With the Great War still very fresh on everyone's minds, the airline founders declared that their new company was inspired by the spirit of ANZAC, which was the name that was used to refer to Australian and New Zealand troops during the war. Now, as the Queensland and Northern Territory bit of their name suggests, that's where the airline was started, and it quickly proved to be a great and fast way for people to get about, which therefore also got really popular. Soon, those who could afford it not only started traveling by air, but also bought shares in this new company as a way to kind of support it further. And that was an early indicator of just how positively Australians would embrace it. In 1935, Qantas then flew its first scheduled flight abroad to Singapore, using a de Havilland DH-86. At the same time, the company was also preparing a flying boat service to enable connection between Australia and the United Kingdom, which was quite a big ask for that era. That service then started in 1938, using multiple stops, with Qantas flying the legs from Sydney over to Singapore, where British Imperial Airways took over, bringing the passengers the rest of the way to Southampton in the United Kingdom. But then came the Second World War, and unsurprisingly, several Qantas aircraft were called into military service, as well as many of their crews, but not all of them. Qantas actually continued operating their domestic flights, and for the first couple of years of the war, they even continued their service over to Singapore. Now, because they had a pool of commercial pilots available at that time, it also meant that they were sometimes given one-off military tasks, like ferrying new aircraft over from the United States. And on top of that, some Qantas flying boats were also used to help evacuating both civilians and service personnel from various hotspots during the war. That wartime service is why Qantas can add the continuously operating qualifier when they claim to be the oldest continuously operating airline in the world. Because technically KLM is about 1 year older than them, but unlike Qantas, they temporarily stopped operations during the Second World War. Now, there was also a Colombian airline that evolved into today's Avianca, which was also founded a bit before Qantas, but they didn't operate continuously either. Now, like I mentioned before, not everyone agrees with Qantas' assertion being the oldest one though. Some people argue that KLM actually continued operating in some Dutch colonies, like the Caribbean for example, but I don't know. I think I'm gonna let the Dutch and the Aussies sort this out in the comments below, so get at it, and while you're down there, please like and subscribe as well. In any case, at the end of the war, Qantas immediately restarted their international flights, and up until this point in its history, the airline had still remained a privately owned company, but that all changed in 1947. You see, the Qantas aircraft fleet was by that time getting quite old, and the financial uncertainties of the post-war era had meant that the airline just didn't have enough money to upgrade to new aircraft. So in 1947, Qantas went under federal government ownership and soon acquired some nice new Lockheed Constellations, Convair 240s, and eventually also Super Constellations, who enabled commercial flights over to the United States for the very first time. Qantas then entered the jet age in 1959 when they became the first airline outside of the United States to put the mighty Boeing 707 into service. And their first 747 then arrived in 1971, with the airline constantly expanding its operations both domestically and abroad. Then, in 1995, Qantas was once again privatized, becoming one of the founding members of the One World Alliance in 1998. But before that, in 1987, they had also added another key milestone, their first frequent flyer program. So, why was that so important then? Other airlines like United had introduced these kind of frequent flyer programs already back in the 1970s, but what makes Qantas' frequent flyer program stand out is that it was just insanely popular. Today, Australia has an estimated population of around 27.3 million people, and Qantas' frequent flyer program has 16.4 million members, equivalent to about 60% of the country's entire population. Now, the actual percentage is probably a little bit lower, since this also includes foreign members, but why is the majority of Australians joining this program, and why does it matter? Well, the popularity becomes much easier to understand when you take a good look at Australia as a country. Size-wise, Australia is only about 5% smaller in area than the lower 48 American states, but like I said earlier, Australia's population is only around 27.3 million people, not even 1/10 that of the United States. Now, in the case of the United States, it is customary to say that the country's population is more densely concentrated near its coastlines, and the same is true for Australia as well, but to a much more extreme extent. There are, of course, some exceptions to this, but it's fair to say that the country's population is overwhelmingly concentrated at or near the coastline. For example, Canberra, Australia's capital, is considered to be an inland city because it's just over 110 kilometers or 68 miles away from the coastline. But if you look at its location on a map, it doesn't look that much inland to me. The point I'm trying to make with all of this is that about 2/3 of Australians live in urban areas, and most of the rest aren't too far away from the coast either. So moving around this country means covering some vast distances, and flying is a big part of making that possible. And that's only talking about domestic travel. When going abroad, Australians also want good access to destinations in, for example, Europe and North America, which isn't easy considering the enormous distances involved. So knowing that, having their own robust and healthy national airline with the right aircraft fleet and capacity for these far-flung destinations is just really, really important for Australians. And it's almost equally important that this airline can offer enough tickets at the right price, and that the pricing is worth keeping in mind for what's about to come. When you combine all of these factors, you can see that Qantas today isn't just a part of Australia's identity outside the country. No, it's a flag carrier that matters way more to its country's people than the typical ceremonial value that most other flag carriers have. And that is something you need to keep in mind as we now start digging into the variety of things that the management of Qantas has done lately. And yes, we're not talking about one single thing. There are several. At this point, we also have to introduce a specific character in this story, former Qantas CEO Alan Joyce. Joyce ran the company for nearly 15 years, having risen through its ranks before finally taking over at the helm as CEO. His journey in the airline world started with Aer Lingus in his native country of Ireland, where he worked from 1988 to 1996. He then moved down under and took up a position with Ansett Australia, but moved on to Qantas only about 4 years later. There he then moved upwards and finally became the CEO in 2008, which, as I'm sure many of you remember, wasn't a very easy year for the airline industry, or really any other industry for that matter. The financial meltdown in 2008 inevitably also affected Qantas, with the first job cuts and other tough measures coming in 2011.
Joyce, the boss of Qantas, says those redundancies will be across the board, including pilots, management and engineers.
And then in 2012, the airline also reported its first full-year financial loss since going private about 17 years earlier.
It's going to be a lot of hard work, a lot of initiatives like the initiatives that we've made to get that business back to profit.
Now, obviously, CEOs don't get very popular when they go around cutting costs, but to a lot of people in the industry, Joyce was a very good fireman CEO, keeping the airline on its feet through really tough periods like the financial crisis and later also through the early stages of the pandemic. An example of how he acted was when Joyce in March 2020 announced that he would give up his salary for the next few months, which he also did, and he only started getting his base salary back in August that same year. But to put that in perspective, the airline also had to furlough or fire thousands of employees during that COVID crisis in order to stay afloat. Now, Many airlines around the world were making similar moves at that time, but Qantas soon started attracting some unusual complaints. In particular, when thousands of flights were inevitably cancelled during the pandemic, the airline started giving people travel vouchers instead of the refunds that many travelers felt that they were entitled to. Again, that wasn't an unusual move among airlines in 2020 and 2021 due to the sheer volume of border closures and cancellations, but the travel vouchers that Qantas issued had expiry dates so short that they would expire before those travel restrictions had been lifted. Because of this, Qantas soon faced a class action lawsuit and later removed those expiry dates, but they only did that last summer in 2023 for flights between January of 2020 and November of 2022. Now, if that was all that Qantas did, maybe this wouldn't have been much of a story, but it turns out that this was only the beginning. As borders finally started to reopen, many Australians complained that the ticket prices with Qantas now seemed very high, almost double what they had been in 2019 before the pandemic. And in October of 2022, an explanation for this came from a very unexpected source, the then Qatar Airways CEO Akbar Al-Bakr. You see, Al-Bakr, who has since retired but wasn't a stranger to controversy himself, pointed out that Qantas still flew only about 50% of its pre-pandemic flights. And that was at a time when people who had been stuck at home for 2 years finally got a chance to go somewhere. Now remember, a big reason why Australians were loyal to Qantas in the first place was because they wanted the safety of having their own carrier who could offer plenty of affordable seats to their desired destinations. So this super slow ramp up with higher prices was not what many Australians was expecting from Qantas. In other parts of the world, airlines with good finances were using this early recovery period to get a leg up on their competitors by adding more routes, breaking into new markets, and trying to steal their competitors' customers away with lower prices. But not Qantas. Now, normally, if an airline doesn't want to fly much, other airlines will swoop in and do that instead. And that was exactly what Qatar had wanted to do here. Until 2022, Qatar had flown into Australian cities 28 times per week, and they had now applied for 21 additional weekly flights. But that application was rejected in July of 2023. As it turns out, Qantas had written to the Australian government opposing Qatar's application since, in their words, it would distort the market. But the funny thing here was that other airlines in that same market, like Virgin Australia, didn't agree at all and actually supported Qatar's position. There is little doubt that Qatar's added flights would have driven down ticket prices, but Australia's government simply refused, stating that this would hurt Australian enterprises, like Qantas. Now, this was of course classic protectionism, and even before this happened there had been a lot of complaints that over the years politicians belonging to different political parties had often been a bit too accommodating to Qantas in ways that didn't always seem to benefit the public. Now all of this followed the publications of another move Qantas had made back in 2020. You see, Qantas had then fired 1,700 baggage handlers, citing the pandemic as the reason for doing so, but they then ended up outsourcing these job positions instead of rehiring those same people, in part because they wanted to weaken the union these workers were belonging to. Now, since then, a court has decided that Qantas fired these workers illegally, so they will have to sort that out somehow, but it really didn't look very good when this story came out. In fact, most of these stories that I've now told you broke within a few weeks of each other last summer in 2023. And as those storms were raging, another story made it clear that all of this had been happening at the same time as Qantas was making record profits. In 2023, the company earned 2.47 billion Australian dollars. That's about 1.6 billion US dollars. And that, of course, led to generous bonuses being handed out to the airline's executives, including the then CEO Alan Joyce. And if that wasn't enough, the airline also spent another 500 million Australian dollars in share buybacks, bolstering the share price for its investors. And that put all of those other stories into a disturbing perspective. You see, refusing ticket refunds, keeping prices high, protecting the airline from competition, slashing and outsourcing jobs, all of that might have been possible to explain or excuse at least if the airline was up against the ropes financially, but no, it was actually doing better than it ever had. To add insult to injury here, Qantas had also been receiving state support during the pandemic, adding up to around 2.7 billion Australian dollars. And unlike some of the other national carriers who got state aid and then gradually returned it, Qantas stated that they didn't intend to pay any of that money back at all. Then, on the 29th of August last year, with people in Australia still trying to process many of these other stories, came what was to many in the country the straw that broke the camel's back. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC, launched a court action against Qantas because the airline had been advertising tickets for thousands of flights that, in reality, they had already cancelled between May and July of 2022. Now, sometimes there might be a short delay between flight cancellations and a website getting updated with the correct information, but that's not what we're talking about here. The ACCC found that Qantas kept selling tickets for at least 8,000 flights for an average of more than 2 weeks, and in some cases up to 47 days after they had actually cancelled them, likely knowing full well that people were now paying for flights that they were not going to be able to fly. And even worse, Qantas then took on average 18 days, in some cases up to 47 days, to notify the existing passengers of those over 10,000 flights that these flights had actually been cancelled. Now, these cancellations didn't have anything to do with bad weather or other circumstances beyond the airline's control. Instead, it seems that they were instead done by purely operational reasons. Now, you would think that after such a chain of embarrassing stories, Qantas and its management would be apologetic and remorseful, but no, they weren't, at least not to begin with. Instead, on the day that the ACCC announced its suit, Qantas was quick to respond, saying that they would happily make its case in the courts. And the interesting thing was that the airline didn't really try to deny what had happened. Instead, they simply put it down to disruptions of the pandemic. Although, again, this actually happened well later, when Australia had opened its borders in May and June of 2022. In the days that followed, reactions to what Qantas did completely snowballed, and the company's management soon realized the scale of the new public relations disaster. Previously, Alan Joyce had planned to retire from his post as CEO in November, the 15th anniversary of when he took up that position in 2008. But now he ended up actually leaving 2 months earlier, in September instead, leaving the company to face 3 separate legal challenges: the expiring travel vouchers, the outsourced baggage handlers' jobs, and the sale of cancelled tickets.
CEO Alan Joyce fast-tracking his retirement effective immediately amid growing pressure.
Obviously, almost immediately after he left, people started asking, should Alan Joyce actually be allowed to get his planned exit payout after all of what had happened? Including bonuses, his goodbye gift would originally have been 21 million Australian dollars, or around 14 million US dollars. And that's a lot of money no matter how you turn it. It was later finally announced that Joyce would get less than half of that amount, 9.26 million Australian dollars instead, and he was then replaced in the CEO chair by the company's then Chief Financial Officer, Vanessa Hudson, who has since apologized for the company's actions. Initially, the ACCC said that it would seek a record penalty of 250 million Australian dollars for the cancelled tickets that the airline had sold, and this would double the biggest ever fine given out to a corporation in Australia. But in the end, Qantas and the ACCC ended up settling out of court. As part of that agreement, the airline ended up having to pay 120 million Australian dollars, about 79 million US dollars for this last fiasco. But out of that money, $100 million was the fine itself, and only 20 million went to the affected customers, all 86,000 of them. That's 232 Australian dollars and 56 cents per person on average. Now, Qantas today operates over 60% of all domestic flights in Australia, and on top of everything else, its late flight cancellations and protectionisms it enjoyed has led to a scarcity of available slots at key airports, which may have contributed to the financial struggles of other small Australian airlines and startups. The motto of Qantas is "the spirit of Australia," but in the eyes of many Australians, their national carrier have now gone from an icon of national identity and pride to a disgrace, all in the space of a few weeks. Now, I'm sure Qantas will do fine in the future. Their latest financial results are a little bit gloomier, but given how they have behaved, they should have some extra resources tucked away. So the real question is, will the Australians end up forgiving their national carrier? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and also let me know if there's any other airline controversies that you think that I should be covering on this channel. The airline industry is a highly competitive, sometimes cruel world, and this means that a new or small airline often have to be both bold and ambitious, taking calculated risks in order to take on bigger players and still survive. But those risks don't always bring rewards, and today I'm going to take a look at an airline that followed this strategy and was severely punished for it. This is the story of Norwegian Air Shuttle. Stay tuned. I recently made a video on Qantas in Australia and its fall from grace, and I got the feeling that you guys really like those type of videos, so I thought I would look at some other airlines with a notable but turbulent recent history. Now, if you're in Europe or perhaps even in North America, you have probably heard of Norwegian Air Shuttle. This airline has gone through a really humbling time recently, but when they first started, their story was a really positive and inspiring one, a kind of David versus Goliath of Scandinavian aviation. Norwegian Air Shuttle first started their operations back in 1993, and the reason it had shuttle in its name was because it was meant to be a small regional carrier that would act as a feeder or shuttle to Bråtens, which was a long-standing airline based in Norway. Initially, Norwegian operated its regional routes with just 3 Fokker 50 turboprops, which they had actually inherited from an even older, bankrupt regional airline called Busy Bee. That airline had served the same feeder role for Bråtens since the 1960s, and many of the original Norwegian air crews and ground staff as well also came from that older airline. Norwegian's fleet eventually grew to 6 Fokker 50s, and the airline was profitable, but still very much limited to its traditional feeder role. But that all changed very abruptly in 2001. The problem was that while Norwegian was doing reasonably well, the same couldn't really be said for their partner Bråtens. Around 1999, they had begun to consolidate their operations in order to try and stay afloat, but by 2001 even that wasn't enough. So Bråtens was eventually bought by Scandinavian Airline Systems, SAS, the flag carrier for Norway, Sweden and Denmark, and SAS had their own ideas for how to operate a feeder service for Bråtens, evolving a subsidiary of their own called SAS Commuter. Now, Norwegian thought that they would get an 18-month notice if something were to change to their operations plan, because that's what was written in their old contract with Bråtens. But in November of 2001, SAS unilaterally just cancelled that contract, effective immediately, leaving Norwegian hanging high and dry. Obviously, this wasn't very nice, although SAS had also laid off a lot of Bråtens employees during the acquisition, so their dismissal of Norwegian without any notice maybe shouldn't have come as such a surprise. But Norwegian's management still had good reason to be quite pissed off. Now, the old saying is, if you can't beat them, join them. But Norwegian basically now decided to do the opposite. If you can't join them, beat them. So early in 2002, instead of just rolling over, they just continued to fly some of their old routes that they had previously operated for Bråtens, effectively starting to compete with the giant SAS. But Norwegian's management quickly realized that they really wouldn't stand a chance in this game in the current form, so they decided to make a pretty big pivot in their business, taking part in something that had become kind of a trend in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Norwegian would switch from a feeder regional carrier into a low-cost carrier, and to do this they replaced their 6 Fokker F-50s with a leased fleet of Boeing 737-300s and later also a couple of old MD-80s. Now, I know that many of you guys who are regular viewers of this channel know how a low-cost carrier works, but I will still explain it quickly here because it's kind of important for this story. From the point of view of the passenger, these airlines offer very few frills on their basic fare, which is probably how you guys know them, but that's not really what makes them low-cost carriers, since many charters and traditional regionals also offer similar fare options. No, instead, the low cost in the low-cost carrier name refers to the airline's own operating costs. You see, low-cost carriers minimize these costs as much as humanly possible, whilst also maximizing revenue at the same time. For example, low-cost carriers often fly from secondary airports that have relatively low handling fees and less competition for airport slots, and they generally also cut down on anything that's not directly needed, like air bridges and fancy new terminals if they can avoid them. Also, it's important to note that aircraft only really make money for their airlines when they are in the air. So low-cost carriers aim to fly their fleets a lot, partially by keeping the turnaround between flights as short as possible. And by the way, that's normally great news for you as passengers, because that means that low-cost carriers really can't afford much delays. If they have too many of those, the last flight of the day might have to be cancelled, which comes at really high cost, so they will do everything they can to avoid that. The low-cost carrier model also means that these airlines need relatively young and efficient aircraft who burns less fuel per passenger and who also doesn't require as much frequent and costly unscheduled maintenance, which can disrupt that tight schedule of theirs. But keeping planes in the air constantly requires having a good, well-thought-out destination network along with an appropriately sized fleet. And for young low-cost carriers who can only afford having a small fleet, this is a big problem, especially to start with. The solution to this in terms of costs involves flying older jets that are very cheap to lease or even to buy outright. That way, if a route isn't profitable for part of the year, the airline don't have to worry too much about keeping parts of its fleet grounded. They will still lose money if they do that, but obviously not as much as if they had leased brand new jets and then parked them up while paying for that big lease. The point I'm trying to make here is that as a low-cost carrier grows, there is normally a point where it has to suddenly switch from flying conservatively with older jets into flying intensely with newer ones in order to keep growing. This is a delicate balance that radically changes the airline's daily operations and has tripped up a lot of airlines in the industry historically. So how did Norwegian Air Shuttle handle this shift? Was there a transition into a grown low-cost carrier where things went wrong? By 2008, Norwegian had a fleet of 40 aircraft and was in the process of beginning to replace their older 737-300s and MD-80s with bigger 737-800s. Up until that moment, Norwegian's growth was a success story. Their management had done their homework well and had managed to pull this part off of their LCC transformation successfully. The new Boeing 737-800s that were arriving had more seats, easing growth, and were also much more efficient. As Björn Färm explains in Liham News, that's part of how low-cost carriers keep their costs low. So, thanks to the rising proportion of new, more efficient aircraft in its fleet, Norwegian was both forecasting a drop in its fuel costs and a reduction in technical costs, in other words, maintenance bills. And at the same time, Norwegian expanded their route network carefully and therefore managed to keep their planes around 80% full on average, which wasn't quite as good as other really big low-cost carriers like Ryanair and EasyJet, but still better than a lot of legacy airlines. Now, 2008 and 2009 weren't particularly good years for aviation thanks to the financial crisis, but Norwegian continued to grow right through that period, and they even increased the proportion of their new 737-800s that they owned outright compared to those that they were leasing, something that was reducing their running costs even further. And then came 2010, which is when Norwegian announced something really unusual. They presented a deal to lease their first two Boeing 787 widebodies, aimed to be used for new routes to the United States starting from 2012, which meant that they were now diving headfirst into low-cost, long-haul operations. Now that type of low-cost carrier is much rarer than those operating short and medium-haul, and there are many good reasons for that. Making that type of operation work in the low-cost carrier model is especially challenging because things like quick turnarounds and high utilization are much harder to organize when flying long-haul. Short and medium-haul long-cost carriers in Europe often operate from small bases, flying out and back routes, which enabled crews to always start and end their duties at home. That's how I've been flying my entire career. And that type of operations means that airlines doesn't have to pay for hotels, scheduling becomes much easier, and the crews get to sleep in their own beds every night, which most of them prefers. But by contrast, long-haul LCC crews generally can't operate the return leg immediately after landing and therefore can't do the same thing. This means that a long-haul LCC will need 2 separate crews for each flight, one for the outbound flight and another one for the return flight. And these are often then augmented crews with 1 or 2 extra pilots depending on how long the flight duration is. Also, the fact that, for example, a transatlantic flight goes through several time zones means that arrival and departure times for 2 out and back legs might not be very practical or even desirable for the passengers. And this fact also impacts the maximum duty and rest time for the crews. And those are not even the only things that make this type of operation challenging. Just think of what happens if a wide-body aircraft has a technical issue when it's 7 hours away from its home base and the airline then needs to send an empty replacement jet. Doing the same for a stock 737 2 hours away is bad enough, but with a wide-body it could cancel out the airline's entire earnings on that route for days. But for Norwegian, one crucial detail that spoke to their favor was that unlike the gradual way that they had evolved and grown their single-aisle fleet in the 2000s, they now aim to start and grow their low-cost long-haul fleet fast, without that intermediate step using older jets. The airline also intended to keep a really fast growth pace, both for its single-aisle and its wide-body fleets. And this all seemed to work, because 10 years after Norwegian had reinvented themselves as a low-cost carrier, they were now looking stronger than ever. But the same could not be said about SAS, their old competitor. 10 years after they had dumped Norwegian as a feeder, the newcomer had basically dominated much of SAS' old European market, and Norwegian was now about to also accelerate that growth further. In 2012, at a time when they operated fewer than 70 jets in total, Norwegian placed an order for another 100 brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8s, plus 22 737-800s. And to everyone's surprise, they also announced an order for 100 Airbus A320neo family jets, with another 50 options, and they later added 30 long-range Airbus A321LRs to this order. While all of this was going on, Norwegian also launched a leasing company as a subsidiary, which could lease out its aircraft to other airlines if they would be delivered before Norwegian actually needed them themselves. This was a kind of safeguard of sorts, since the airline continued to grow really rapidly and needed a buffer if something wouldn't go exactly to plans. As an example, their first Airbus A320neos arrived in 2016, but Norwegian themselves never actually flew them. Instead, their new leasing company, Arctic Aviation Assets, placed them with other airlines around the world. Or at least that was the plan, but I'll get back to that soon. In any case, I think that you're beginning to see here that during the mid-2010s, Norwegian had their hands in a lot of different pies. They had by this point replaced their 737 Classics with 737 NGs and were now in the process of also replacing them with 737 MAXes. They had leased or bought a growing fleet of Boeing 787s to start a separate long-haul arm, and they had ordered Airbus single-aisle jets to diversify their fleet and also to try to fly Airbus A321LRs on long-haul routes where the 787 were just too big. To support all of these plans, they launched several subsidiaries, including a bank that handled its customer loyalty program and others who were involved in recruiting, hiring and training pilots in a number of locations around Europe. The problem was that, as Björn Färm explained in his detailed analysis, Norwegian was doing all of this with a very weak balance sheet. Its equity ratio in 2016 was only 11%, when airlines like EasyJet and Ryanair were sitting with ratios well above 50%. Very simplistically speaking, a low equity ratio means that a company still has to pay off big costly loans or similar obligations compared to the values of its assets. And this might well be acceptable if a company is profitable and can service those debts. But that's a very big if. A balance sheet like this basically means that the company is very vulnerable to crisis, and as most of you guys know by now, there are a lot of those crises in aviation. Now, Norwegian's expansion plan might well have worked, but for that they would have needed everything to work perfectly, and that just did not happen. When Norwegian ordered their first 787s back in 2010, the type hadn't even entered service yet, and as we now know, the 787 would soon suffer production delays from various different maturity issues, including lithium battery fires and later also longevity issues with its engines. So to keep their long-haul plans going when the 787 deliveries were delayed, Norwegian were forced to wet lease in Airbus A340s and even an Airbus A380 to operate its transatlantic routes. And while wet leases, which means that the aircraft comes with an entire crew, can be very helpful for closing short-term operational gaps, they are not a cheap way to do long-term business. So those aircraft delivery delays and engine issues really hampered Norwegian's long-haul profitability, to put it mildly. And I know that many of you are expecting me to say that Boeing's 737 MAX problems came next, but actually Norwegian had a couple of other issues that came before that. In 2017, Norwegian officially became the largest airline in Scandinavia, beating SAS in overall passenger numbers. But the other thing that happened that year was that Norwegian's chief financial officer suddenly left the company without providing a convincing explanation as to why. The industry and the markets in general, who were already nervous about Norwegian's risky strategy, reacted to this immediately, with Norwegian's stock price suffering greatly as a result. And only a few days later, in July of 2017, Norwegian published its latest financial results, which showed that they had now started to sell the table silver, as Björn Färm put it. The airline was selling shares in their own customer loyalty program in order to make up for their, by this point, spiraling operating expenses. Weirdly, at that same time, Norwegian was also exposed to a problem affecting operators of Airbus A320neos, even though they themselves actually never did. You see, as I mentioned before, Norwegian and their leasing subsidiary had ordered these jets with Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engines, and early teething problems with those engines meant that Norwegian and their lessors now couldn't find any airlines to lease these planes to. This meant that many of these jets went straight from factory into storage, again a very costly thing to do. Imagine taking a loan to buy a Ferrari and then leaving it in your parents' garage to gather dust. But Norwegian's management didn't seem to get spooked by this. So instead of switching to a more conservative strategy, they instead sold and then leased back several jets in order to improve their liquidity. And incredibly, around the same time, they also decided to go ahead with some previous plans they had to launch a new airline subsidiary in Argentina. This company, Norwegian Air Argentina, started its operations in October of 2018, and whilst they were starting up, the rest of the group continued their expansion plans, hiring even more pilots and cabin crew from all over Europe. At this point, airline groups like Lufthansa and AIG had started inquiring about the possibility of buying the airline, but the Norwegian management just said no. A few months later, the 737 MAX got grounded worldwide after the second of two devastating crashes, and Norwegian were operating 14 of them at the time, with many more scheduled to arrive soon, which of course they didn't. The MAX would instead stay grounded for over about a year and a half, landing another devastating blow to Norwegian Air Shuttle's plans. Now, it still took Norwegian's management several months after the MAX grounding to finally confirm plans that they were switching from expansion to cost-cutting. Björn Kjos, the airline's CEO for 17 years and the guy who had turned it into a low-cost carrier in the first place, resigned in July of 2019, and with that, the company went into full survival mode. They immediately shut down the Argentinian subsidiary, returned aircraft to lessors, postponed new aircraft deliveries, and generally saved money wherever they could. But their CEO's departure still caused the airline's stock price to lose 85% of its value compared to only 12 months earlier. At this point, there were still some people thinking that the airline could be bought by Lufthansa or another airline group, but that hope evaporated when the pandemic reared its ugly head in the spring of 2020. Any airline who had any type of issues with its finances would obviously find itself under enormous pressure when this happened, and Norwegian had, as I explained, already been struggling for a while by then. At this point, I should also explain that Norwegian had kept separate airline operator certificates in different countries, in addition to the main company in Norway itself. There were Norwegian Air Sweden, Norwegian Air UK, which handled its long-haul operations with the 787s, and there had also been other entities before that, like Norwegian Air Argentina. In addition to these, the airline also worked with external staffing companies for many of its flight and cabin crews based in Sweden, Denmark, as well as in Spain. So when the pandemic hit, Norwegian almost immediately fired 7,300 people in its various subsidiaries, amounting to 90% of the group's total workforce. They also terminated agreements with those staffing agencies, which triggered their bankruptcy and the losses of another 4,700 pilot and cabin crew jobs in Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Spain, the UK, as well as in the US. The core Norwegian Air Shuttle got some pandemic-related relief by Norway, but it found less sympathy elsewhere, with Sweden, for example, refusing to back their initial recovery plans since the airline's woes had clearly started way before 2020. Eventually, the core company did survive, after convincing governments and creditors to support them following announcement of extreme drastic cuts. They would cut down their fleet from 140 aircraft to just 50 and also stop all long-haul operations and return their 787s to the lessors. At this point, the 737 MAX was back in service, but Norwegian returned all of those to the lessors as well, since 737-800s were a lot cheaper to lease, and all aircraft orders they had placed to Boeing and Airbus were cancelled. Now today, Norwegian's fleet has steadily grown again, back up to 86 aircraft, including some 737 MAX 8s, and they have also recently acquired Widerøe, a Norwegian regional operator flying Dash 8 turboprops, kind of a modern-day equivalent to the feeder airline that Norwegian once was. But there are still no 787s flying the Norwegian Air Shuttle flag. Many of those instead today fly with Norse Atlantic, a new long-haul low-cost carrier serving a similar role but with a less aggressive growth strategy. Similarly, a Norwegian short and medium-haul airline called Flyr emerged back in 2021, possibly on the back of very favorable leasing deals available on the back of Norwegian's drastic demise, but they shut their doors only about a year and a half later. Now, one thing that I want to point out before we end this video is that Norwegian Air Shuttle had a very good reputation with its crews before it collapsed. They were thought of as an airline with a good working atmosphere and working conditions, even better than some legacy carriers, but their collapse and declared bankruptcy of their European subsidiaries left a sour taste to many of their former employees outside of Norway. Some of my best friends were treated very poorly when Norwegian panic shut the doors, and I personally don't think that an airline should be allowed to restart operations using the same name before they've paid what they owe to their old employees. As pilots, we are said to be only as good as our last landing, so in my view, an airline is only as good as its last actions. As for the cause of their collapse, to this day people disagree on whether Norwegian was just too greedy with their growth plan or just unlucky. But what do you think? Could Norwegian have done things differently? I'm guessing that none of you have missed that around Christmas, Southwest Airlines in the United States had the worst meltdown of its entire history, cancelling thousands of flights and leaving unprecedented numbers of passengers stranded.
One of the worst airline meltdowns in U.S. history.
Southwest has canceled more than 13,000 flights in the past week.
What a mess. And tonight, the Senate Commerce Committee and the U.S. Department of Transportation, they plan to investigate.
But what was the real reason for this? Why didn't other airlines have the same problem, and hasn't this already happened before, also to Southwest? Stay tuned. Have you ever heard a saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Well, if you have, you probably also know that it basically means if you have something that works, especially if it's something that's really important to your work, you should probably leave it alone and don't mess with it too much. It's a saying that applies to a lot of things in life, and it normally works out quite well until it doesn't. The problem is that it isn't always so easy to see when an old but reliable process isn't as reliable anymore, and what you're about to see in this video is a great example of that. One of the big criticisms of Southwest after this Christmas meltdown was that the airline knew that there was a problem in its scheduling systems, even before this had happened, because this wasn't the first time that this particular problem had shown itself. Back in October of 2021, there was some controversy around another large-scale Southwest disruption. This time, it was stormy weather in Florida that seemed to trigger this very similar event. But the reasons that this disruption in 2021 was controversial and that the scheduling programs didn't get much attention back then was because that this happened during the time when many airlines in the United States had to abide by mandatory employee vaccination programs. Southwest was one of these airlines who had to follow the rules of American government contractors, and they had just announced that they would require their employees to get vaccinated before storms hit Florida and these massive disruptions happened. Other airlines with significant operations in Florida also had to cancel flights back then, but nowhere as many as Southwest had to. The airline cancelled as many as 1,900 flights, which amounted to 3 out of 4 cancellations in the entire country. But like I said, back then, many observers thought that this huge disruption had to do with employee walkouts due to the vaccine mandates. Both the airline and the crew unions denied this, but few outside of the airline actually seemed to believe them. To be absolutely clear here, those type of walkouts might well have happened at a small scale, but they did not create this complete system meltdown and the huge disruptions that followed. Now, the October 2021 meltdown was bad, but it didn't necessarily show to outsiders at least that the airline had a systemic problem. 1,900 flight calculations is an enormous number, but it's not unprecedented. In the past, American Airlines, Delta, JetBlue and others have had major disruptions affecting as many or many more flights than that. But the disruptions around Christmas this past year was very different. In a week, Southwest ended up cancelling over 16,700 flights, making it the biggest airline meltdown in history. The airline previously expected to post quite strong profits in the last quarter, but now, unsurprisingly, it expects a dramatic loss instead. And just as importantly, they're also suffering a dramatic hit to their reputation that could take months or even years to recover from. Now, Southwest are trying to soften the blow as much as they can by promising refunds to passengers for their cancelled flights, and they might also be liable to pay for hotels, rental cars and other alternative travel arrangements. But on top of that, there are also proposed class action lawsuits from passengers who claim to have only received credit for their cancelled flights. And more generally, this event brought new scrutiny into the way airlines operate, the risks to their schedules and the responsibilities towards their passengers. The US Senate has already announced that it will hold hearings to understand why this debacle actually happened in the first place. Now, Southwest Airlines is not just any airline. It is one of the most successful, if not actually the most successful airlines in history. They have turned a profit for 47 consecutive years, and the 48th was, well, 2020. And even on that horrible year, they diversified into new destinations as they tried to increase their market share in an otherwise completely shell-shocked aviation world. Southwest is pretty much the only major US carrier that didn't undergo either bankruptcy or some form of major reorganization before or after 9/11, or really at any time during their history. In 2020, the airline avoided putting most of their jets into long-term storage, meaning that they were ready to bounce back when demand for flying returned. So they actually handled the COVID crisis much better than most other airlines. So if they are such a great airline, then why did this enormous meltdown happen? To understand what happened during this meltdown, we first have to look at what kind of an airline we're dealing with here. Southwest is the world's largest low-cost carrier, and they're often credited as the airline that built the model for how successful low-cost carriers should operate. Their operation relies on quick turnarounds that maximizes the utilization of their aircraft fleet. They do offer extra amenities to passengers for a charge, but its aircraft have all economy cabins, which greatly helps simplify operations. The airline also have homogeneous fleets of 737, which means that all of its crews can operate on all of their aircraft, giving them great flexibility. And This detail, the fact that the airline uses one single aircraft type, is where our look into Southwest Meltdown actually begins. And by the way, here I also wanted to give a shout out and some credit to John Ostrower and Courtney Miller in The Air Current, whose article into the details of this event gave us some invaluable insights. So check out their work in the link in the description below. So Southwest Airlines currently has a fleet of around 780 aircraft, which is a lot. Of those, over half, or around 430, are 737-700s, over 200 are 737-800s, and the rest are 737 MAX 8s. Now, there are airlines out there with bigger fleets than this, but their fleets are not of one single aircraft family, and that's important when it comes to the kind of workload that the scheduling systems of different airlines have. When an airline has fleets of different types, this means that the scheduling system basically treats each aircraft type separately. That's because each pilot can only operate a single type. There might be some scheduling crossover where, for example, an airline uses a 737 for a specific flight on most days of the week and then switches it over to an Airbus A320 for the remainder. But at any given time, each of the airline's pilots will only fly on one family of jets. Rules for cabin crew scheduling between different aircraft types might be a little bit more flexible than that, but in general, because the crews that operate different types are separated, the scheduling systems for each type is also more or less separate. And that means that the system has fewer people and therefore fewer parameters to work with when large numbers of changes are necessary. I'm sure that you can see where this is going. The fact that every Southwest pilot can fly on every one of Southwest's 780 jets means that the scheduling system has a much higher number of people to keep track of. So the very thing that gives Southwest its edge also means that the airline has a much more complicated ballet of aircraft, pilots and cabin crew placed all over a huge country which its scheduling system must keep track of. Obviously, during periods of high travel demand like the Christmas holidays combined with sketchy weather, the potential for trouble in the system increases. Southwest did know this, so they did cancel many flights preemptively, like many of the other airlines also did during the Christmas period when they saw that the weather was starting to turn bad. But as it would turn out, Southwest didn't cancel nearly enough flights at that early stage. Because then things started going even messier. There are reports that the airline had another complication in Denver, one of its major hubs. Because of the bad weather, the airline was struggling to find enough ramp agents for its operation. This caused somebody to send out a very stern memo to its employees on the 21st of December saying that too many people were calling in sick. According to that memo, employees would need to provide a doctor's note or a doctor's certificate confirming that they actually were sick or they would risk losing their jobs. Some sources suggested that this message prompted multiple resignations. Now, the airline later said that the cold weather conditions reduced the time that each person on the ramp could actually stay outside safely, so it essentially needed to double its ramp personnel to keep up the work, and that they just simply couldn't do that. And that was the point of the all hands on deck memo that it sent out. Either way, this lack of ramp personnel wasn't the basic underlying problem, but it added fuel to the problem, bringing cancellations forward and giving the airline scheduling system less and less time to react. Now, I've mentioned scheduling systems several times, so let's now look into the kind of system, or actually systems, that Southwest was using at the time. To assign crews to specific flights, the airline was using a software called SkySolver. This software isn't at all unique to Southwest. A number of other airlines are also using it, including JetBlue, for example, and each airline would adapt the system to fit its own needs. In Southwest's case, SkySolver got its data about cancellations and flight changes from an internal software called The Baker. Then SkySolver's job was to optimize the scheduling for all crews, matching them to the aircraft that was located in the same place as they were. But a key factor in the way that these two systems worked together was that cancellations or modified flights were handled together in batches or groups. And the system required a certain amount of time to process each batch, and that would take about 20 to 25 minutes or so. But as things got worse and worse, more cancellations and modifications would come in during this 25 to 30 minute window, and that would then force the process to start over again for another 20 to 25 minutes, in which time more cancellations would come in and so on. With each batch of flights, the two systems had to make calculations for flights departing closer and closer in time. According to the air current, SkySolver didn't actually crash, but that really didn't matter, because what the system actually did was it began producing results that were no longer usable. The pilots, cabin crew and aircraft it matched weren't actually matched. One or two of them would have to be flown in flights that were previously seriously delayed or even cancelled. One of the many things that these systems had to calculate that required a lot of processing time is whether or not the crews were legal to fly in terms of the rest and overall flight time limitations. Now, there are different calculations that need to be made for this for different periods during the day, and all of this applies to both flight and cabin crew and has to be accurate in real time. Now, there has been a lot of criticism of Southwest, specifically regarding the lack of investment into software systems that could stay on top of this huge fleet of theirs. This is fair criticism for an airline that specifically relies on quick turnarounds to keep its operation going, and Southwest itself was quick to acknowledge this and also to announce that it will be investing in upgrades to its IT systems. The programs and some of the processes that the airline are currently using dates back to the 1990s, when the airline was 1/10 of its current size. So what this ultimately meant was that when the problems hit, Southwest aircraft started accumulating at different airports that didn't have enough gates or parking for them, which also had a knock-on effect on other airlines. And where a lot of planes are stuck, a lot of crews are also stuck. As time passed, waiting crews that were away from their bases would eventually start to run out of duty time, and therefore they wouldn't be able to continue to operate. And this then led to a different kind of scheduling problem when these stuck pilots and cabin crew needed hotels. And that's because a good number of them were at airports where Southwest didn't have any agreements with hotels, because they wouldn't normally do any night stops there. Of course, all airlines have standby crews on call precisely to deal with disruptions, but the problem that now happened was that a lot of these standby pilots and cabin crew were on the phone, on hold for hours at a time until someone could tell them what to do due to the scale of the disruption. So even though Southwest had created some spare capacity and some extra standby crews by preemptively cancelling some flights, now when they actually needed them, they couldn't find them and deploy them. And on top of that, some spare crews needed to be flown to where they were needed, and that takes time, and also it assumes that other flights won't be cancelled and stop them from going there. So as this progressed, the system just couldn't handle it, and the only way to schedule any of the flight at all was for the schedule to do all of this work manually, and that is a complete nightmare. You see, schedulers would have to check the location of crews and aircraft, and then work out and verify duty times for each crew member and how this duty time would evolve during the day. Duty times start accumulating basically as soon as a crew member is called for duty, and it then continues to run towards a legal maximum, even if this crew member doesn't start to actually work. The fact that they're actually just available can count, and on top of that, the amount of time that they can work changes depending on what time of day it is. Southwest actually did try everything. They were going to such extremes as running classrooms where they would train volunteer staff in handling duty time information handed in by pilots and cabin crew. Here, the airline's people-centered culture actually did pay off, but even after thousands of preemptive cancellations, there was still a ton of work for all of these people to do and to sort out. The silver lining in this mess is that after a certain point, mass cancellations started to make it easy to reset the system. You see, as time goes by and pilots and cabin crew are off duty, their duty time clocks eventually gets reset. From the 26th of December, Southwest cancelled thousands more flights preemptively and stopped new ticket sales, and they did that to stop people from trying to book flights that would likely also get cancelled. Doing this would eventually solve the problem, but inevitably it created more frustration for those passengers who were left behind. Because on several occasions, Southwest would fly an aircraft with no passengers to reposition it when there was previously a cancelled flight from that very same origin to the destination airport where the flight was now going essentially empty. But there simply weren't any time or capacity to figure out what passengers were where and how to reinstate those flights and get the people on board. In situations like this, a full reset is sometimes the only way forward, as painful, wasteful and frustrating as it might be. Now, we will likely hear much more about this story going forward, and to be fair to Southwest, in many cases where an airline deals with an old IT system, it is actually the upgrade process itself that runs the highest risk of causing a disruption. But there's no question here that the airline had made some serious miscalculations. Some of the decisions to postpone the IT investment had to do with cuts that they made back in 2020, but by many accounts, its strategy around these systems goes back many years. But before we finish, in January this year, we also saw another US-wide meltdown when the FAA NOTAM system temporarily failed. The problem itself only lasted about an hour and a half or so, but the delays it caused took many hours for the country's airlines to deal with. Simple events like that could act as another trigger for an airline with troublesome IT systems, like the Southwest experience showed, and there's really only one way forward here, and that is heavy investments in the IT infrastructure that runs this huge type of operations. Now, the NOTAM meltdown and the horrible NOTAM format is likely due for its own video at some point, but until then, check out this video next or this playlist. Please consider supporting the channel by leaving a super thanks, joining my Patreon crew or buying some cool merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.